Okay, let's start with some introductions. I'm Nick Martin, Consulting Director at CTS. I'm joined here today by my colleague Mo, who is CTO at CTS. Mo, a brief introduction from yourself.
Good morning, everyone. So, Mohammed Bakir, or Mo for short. So, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at CTS. And we will be talking today around the security within the Chambers world as we talk through the slides.
So just as a brief bit of introduction for myself, I've been working with law firms for a long period of time, looking closely at the sector in terms of transformational activity and strategy around both user experience and all of the different technologies we know and love. Very topical discussion for today. And for those that don't know CTS particularly well, we're an organization completely focused on the legal sector. Our logo, which is shaped for law, spells out what it is we do as an organization. We're very aligned to what both law firms and chambers need to do from a technology and delivery point of view. And a lot of our services are very specific around the legal sector, whether they be data or mobility related or application related. So this is within our DNA in terms of how we work. And I'm pleased that so many people were able to join, and hopefully you'll find this a productive and interesting session. Just in terms of the introduction around the security side of things, we all know it's a significant challenge for everyone, both in our private lives and our work lives. The challenge is increasing all of the time, and following what different people say in the sector, the ICO, the Bar Council, SRA, everyone is really trying to heighten the awareness and challenge that we face around security. And security isn't, or addressing the security challenge isn't just about dealing with teenage hackers or individuals anymore. The organizations that we're trying to keep at bay are highly organized, motivated, well-funded, and they have a long-term approach to how they want to attack and cause problems in terms of your operation. So Mo, if you could kindly give us the next slide.
Yeah.
So the level in terms of attacks is going up all the time. And I think partly this is down to people taking advantage of the hybrid way of working. And that is really here to stay in terms of what we face going forward. So that brings increased risk and increased challenge in terms of securing devices, networks, but also being more aware of some of the challenges we face. And I think that it's no longer just about email phishing, for example. Some of these attacks are really quite severe and well thought through. It's about both securing data, but also about responding. And Mo's going to talk quite a bit about speed of response, analytics, and really how we help you protect both your client data and everyone who works as part of a Chambers. Mo, do you want to comment on that?
Thanks, Nick. So I think I'd start by talking about what we see as the current state of many chambers today from an IT provision. And what does that mean from a security perspective? So we're approaching this from three angles: the user, the IT platform, and the network. We're starting with the user side. So certainly that will vary from a chambers to chamber, but in general, remote access for users who have minimal security awareness. So this is more talking about users having desperate set of devices that tend to be personally procured, that they use for personal and work usage. And it's around the state of security for remote access for those users to access systems, applications, and data. And in the case of just relying on passwords as the main mechanism for security, a lot of people tend to potentially use the same password for multiple different personal or work-related accounts, which kind of adds a layer of potential compromise. If one of those passwords get compromised, an attacker might attempt to use that compromised password for accessing systems or data that relates to work. The second part is around platform. So this is mainly around that several barristers chambers would still have their backend servers, such as the diary system or file shares or other systems that they need that run on an on-premise infrastructure, either in the chambers offices or in a co-located location. And with that associated the backup for your systems and data. Again, it's around how advanced that backup solution and how often your data gets back up and how long it's retained to ensure that there are a point of time where data could be recovered. And we certainly have seen some challenges around that. The idea around the on-premise server and where they sit from a security perspective, it depends on the security controls on the servers themselves and how hardened those servers are, i.e. how much security controls, configurations to lock down to these servers and only authorized access is configured. The idea around on-premise as well comes with related to network, when traditionally you would have a device firewall that secures access to that on-premise infrastructure from the outside world. And traditionally what we'd see is these firewalls that tend to run on-premise are more basic in terms of their setup compared to firewalls, for example, if we talk about cloud and what you get from security and a cloud provision. So that's an area of consideration around how much the firewall at your perimeter is secure, making sure that there are no access rules there that shouldn't be, potentially legacy rules that don't need to be there anymore that could be potentially compromised for a hacker to gain access. And the next part is around wireless security. So ensuring that your Wi-Fi network is secure, that it's got an enhanced level of security, separation of guest access and corporate access around that, and ensuring that that's kept up secure and tested. So in terms of what this means for chambers, there are many opportunities for hackers to exploit a lot of the weaknesses or vulnerabilities in an IT provisions within chambers, IT provision, sorry. That could include, as I alluded to, firewalls. For example, if you have systems that are publicly facing, such as remote desktop servers, for example, or a diary system that is accessed from the outside over the internet, that if the security is not in place to an advanced level, i.e., for example, if you're just relying on a password and you've got remote desktop servers publicly facing and users log on just with their username and password, if a user's password has been compromised, it's very easy for an attacker to get access to that remote desktop environment or a diary system or any public facing system. And from then on, establish access to the rest of the network. And there are two main things that potentially could happen then. A, ransomware, which we've seen a rise in that, i.e. encryption of data and requiring ransom to gain access to the data again, or taking exfiltration of data and information for dark web or other malicious usage of that data, depending on the sensitivity of that data. The second aspect around this is that traditional security measures don't really ensure 100% protection. So when I talk about traditional security measures, I mentioned like you have a firewall at the edge of your network at the perimeter that separates the internal network from the internet. Having wireless with basic authentication or relying on users accessing systems with just password authentication, as opposed to using other tools that we would walk through next in the slides. And security needs to be looked at end to end in a multi-tiered approach. The next part is around detection. So we talked about traditional protection. How do we ensure, or the current state of protection levels within the typically IT provision, but the next part is around detection of hackers. So if there has been a compromise and someone gained access to a system, how quickly could that be detected? How quickly could that be identified? And what could be done about it? So that's currently a challenge with the lack of detection tooling within the IT provisions currently. The next part is around the recovery. It's a question of, in the event that your systems have been compromised and you were subjected, for example, to ransomware, encrypting all your data, requiring you to recover from a backup or a disaster recovery provision, how quickly can that happen? That's an equation that is what factors, the factors in that is how sophisticated is your backup system and ongoing maintenance and management and controls around that backup and ensuring that you've got an up-to-date copy of your backup data. Also, whether you have a disaster recovery solution in place or not, that could make a big difference between recovering your systems in a matter of hours or a couple of days versus weeks of work to rebuild servers and infrastructure if you don't have disaster recovery provision in place. Chambers require multi-layered security, as mentioned. So that's the edge, user access, user devices, and the backend platform. And we will cover each one of those aspects with some recommendations around what chambers need to look for and add into their security posture.
So just a quick question there, Mo. I mean, there's some really good stuff there around some of the technologies and process side, but you know, ongoing education and ongoing review is really important as well, because the hackers are advancing in terms of their skills. The threat vector is shifting. You know, they're very clever in terms of how they approach this. So education and process review all the time important.
Correct, Nick. And yeah, so what we're covering in the next section is around recommendations. One key recommendation there is ensuring that there is a provision for cybersecurity awareness for barristers and members, because as you outlined, hackers are always kind of evolving the way that they try to compromise weaknesses, and things like phishing or malicious web pages that users go click on, etc. Having that security awareness significantly helps with reducing compromise. The weakest part of a security provision is end users and the level of maturity around security or awareness around security that they have. So certainly ongoing cybersecurity awareness is very beneficial, and we would definitely recommend that for chambers that don't have that provision currently, along with ongoing regular security reviews. So always checking the status of your security maturity, gaps if there are any, against known threats or trends from a cybersecurity perspective on an ongoing basis.
Thank you.
Here we're providing a couple of examples from a day-to-day perspective. So in this example, Henry is a representation of a barrister, so he's been a victim of a phishing attack. So with that phishing attack, if Henry's using a similar password or the same password for multiple different accounts, and one of those accounts get compromised, which does happen, that means that a hacker could release a ransomware, locks down Henry's machine to start with, but propagate access to the rest of the wider network and resources that Henry have access to, preventing access to critical documents for court cases, as an example. The next example is Sue, in head of chambers in this case, and that's about being victim of malware. So malware with compromised admin credentials, so gaining access to administrative credentials due to potentially lack of multi-factor authentication. So in this case, the security reliance is just on a password, username and password, no MFA in place. Spying and man-in-the-middle attack results then in sensitive data being released. A hacker with admin privileges could cause havoc on a network, either again on ransomware or releasing information and selling that information to people that may be interested in that, which comes with a whole set of reputational damage, potential data loss that can't be recovered.
I think there's an interesting piece here as well, isn't there, around the level of suspicion or alertness one needs to maintain. It's not just about people from the outside, but the attackers will quite often look for someone to compromise. Could be a family member. It could be Wi-Fi on your home. I read the other day about some electrical car chargers for the home, which had no form of security, and actually they were connected to your home Wi-Fi. So I think there's a stance that you need to take around security, which is that state of perpetual awareness and just being on the front foot and being slightly suspicious of things which are not what you expect.
Correct, Nick. And I think when we talk around what the future state or what the recommended state from a security perspective for chambers need to look like, unsurprisingly, we're starting with the user side. And to start with, one of the observations from a barrister's chamber's perspective is the fact that barristers would use their own devices that they have procured and tend to use that for personal and work-related reasons. So I think an important aspect of maturing security is starting with that end user device, where typically most of the compromises start, and having rationalization for these end user devices. For example, not using devices that run Windows Home Edition or an unsupported version of an operating system that wouldn't be receiving patches or updates from the vendor. Not having patches and updates regularly applied introduces several vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are gaps in security that hackers could compromise. So we definitely recommend that there is a rationalization of the devices that have access to the chamber's resources, the supportability state of these devices, and the level of security configuration that is applied to end user devices. The second part, from a user perspective or user-centric view, is around multi-factor authentication. So that's moving away from just relying on a username and password as the mechanism for authenticating a user, to adding a layer with multi-factor authentication. That significantly makes a difference in terms of credentials and credential compromise, because in this case, an attacker would not just rely on a password. You'd need to have a second factor, which is an authenticator app that you can have on your device that generates random codes that you have to input in order to log on and gain access to an application or a data set. So multi-factor authentication, we think that that's a must-have additional layer of security that chambers need to deploy. The next one is around web security. So having these devices, and as Nick alluded to, the compromise could start by your Wi-Fi network at home. Having these devices subject to web filtering or web proxy, web security, ensures that if there are malicious attempts using web pages that are insecure or potentially harmful, that if you have a web security solution in place, that it could block these type of websites or malware associated with that. And then the other aspect around the user is security training. So that's cyber security awareness training. And there are a variety of options around that, including online video tutorials, some self-assessment, questionnaires around security, scenario-based type assessment, i.e. what if, or what would you do in case of A and B and C. And it really helps educate users and have that alertness from a cybersecurity perspective, particularly when it comes to phishing or malware attempts or man-in-the-middle attacks, that users would be better protected if they are aware of the examples and the types of scenarios that entails.
It's a really important point here, and I read an article on it the other day, Mo, and that was basically saying that the security processes that we had in place pre-COVID all need to be reviewed in light of the style of working we're in now, without any exception, right across the board. And I guess you're pretty keen on that to happen across all of the people we work with.
Definitely, and there is obviously an evidential rise in cyber security attacks targeting law, barristers' chambers and law firms, and we've seen evidence, a lot of evidence around that. So security, our security recommendation at the moment is not potentially an insurance policy. This is a must-have provision for protecting chambers that we believe are currently at heightened security targeting from attackers. Just before I move on to other aspects, just to re-emphasize, I think culturally, barristers could be resistant to having any sort of control or governance around their devices, and they want that freedom to use whatever device they want and whatever version of software that runs on that. And certainly, that's kind of what I've observed in several conversations around some of the challenges around the user side of things. But I think a better dialogue and more focused dialogue around security with the barristers and what it means in the event of a compromise to them individually and to the chambers. That needs to take place as we allude to around the current cybersecurity threats, challenges that the chambers are facing, and the requirement to get chambers into a good security posture, and certainly user device rationalization, having these devices in a supported state, secure, updated, protected, is a must-do. The next part of this is around platform. So previously we talked about the idea of on-premise traditional infrastructure, and what we're talking here is a cloud, a transition into a cloud platform for the back-end systems. And there are multiple security enhancements that are inherently built into cloud provision that is beyond the capability or the security provisions that you would have in an on-premise infrastructure. So that's all the way from firewalls, perimeter security on the internet and public facing, into the resiliency and the security of these cloud platforms that are built from a security perspective, hardened in terms of underlying platform and in terms of access from the outside. So naturally, transition to cloud adds resiliency and additional protection to your back-end systems that you have. In conjunction with that, having a business continuity provision that enables chambers to recover data, recover systems, recover servers quickly and promptly in the event that there is a data loss, either by ransomware or other types of compromise. Having that business continuity provision in place ensures that you can get back into a working state as quickly as possible, and you don't have to resort to rebuilding all your systems from scratch if you don't have a business continuity provision or a valid backup or valid recent backup in place.
Just a quick question there, Mo. Clearly, we're believers in that you should back up all your configurations and data on a regular basis, perhaps a tiered basis. What's your view in terms of the approach to backup?
So the challenge around backing up on a regular basis and in a fast recovery way with on-premise infrastructure, that you typically need to isolate your backup copy, the data that you backed up, in an offsite location or an isolated location from your primary data. In the event that if there is a compromise in your main IT systems that doesn't also compromise backups, hackers usually tend to encrypt backup data first before they encrypt production data to prevent the chance or to block the user from attempting to recover data from backup. So having that backup offsite is one of the requirements. However, with having that backup offsite with traditional backup methods, you're kind of limited from the frequency you can run that backup at, and network speed and bandwidth available to replicate or take a copy of that data on a more regular basis becomes a challenge and a consideration. And what we see on average, that there is a reliance on typically a daily backup. However, that daily backup doesn't give that near point restore capability, i.e. you would lose a full day worth of data. That's assuming that you have a valid, successful daily backup in place. And we have seen examples where there's still some reliance on things like tape or daily, or even more than that in terms of offsite backups. It's quite tedious to restore the data. It takes quite a bit of time. And that's, again, one of the benefits in transitioning to a cloud platform, that the inherent provision around cloud platforms, that it accelerates that protection, both from a business continuity and delivering that ongoing lower recovery point objective, i.e. allowing data to be backed up a lot more often than traditionally with on-premise servers being backed up over the internet.
Thanks, Mike.
The third aspect from a platform, and this is very relevant to chambers as well, is around the adoption of Microsoft 365 and transitioning into the use of Microsoft 365, not just for email, but for document storage as well. That's being OneDrive or SharePoint. Again, with 365 in similar sense to the cloud, there is a lot of built-in security controls and maturity in Microsoft 365 in terms of how the data is stored in the 365 platform, the level of access controls that you could have and apply around access to emails, data over the internet, whether that's in OneDrive or SharePoint. It gives you the ability to centralize policy and governance for the chambers. So if you have certain policy and governance requirements, that you can apply that through the Microsoft 365 management side. And it unlocks the capability around things like conditional access, for example, i.e. users that are using a device that is not in a supported state, they get only access to X and Y. If the device is running the latest updates and patches and is in a supported operating system, then they have more access to data and email in that case. So there's a lot of security related enhancements that chambers would benefit from by transitioning to 365. And traditionally, the backend infrastructure, i.e. the servers that chambers required to run, it's not a significant amount of servers that are required. The use is mainly around the diary system, some data storage and email, and that could much of that could easily be transitioned to Microsoft 365, giving you that additional protection. With that also, on 365 comes the ability to better protect end user devices. That's both from a protection, i.e. that safeguarding of the device with endpoint protection tools, centralized management tools, policy-based provisioning, but also the detection, i.e. the ability to detect a malicious activity on an end user device quickly and promptly before that attempt of compromise makes its way to the wider network. So both elements, protection and detection. The third part is the network, which is having hardening of your firewalls. So having a security assessment and review of your perimeter firewalls, ensuring that there are no rules, access rules that don't need to be there. The existing rules that are in place are secure as optimally as possible, and ensuring your firewalls run a latest supported security release that have the enhancements that should be enabled. The second one is around endpoint security. So as I was just alluding to a minute ago, around part of the Microsoft 365 benefits is having the ability to add on or bolt on around that end user secure endpoint or end user device security, both from a protection in the sense that antivirus and so on, and detection in terms of being able to detect any malicious activities or changes in behavior that represent a different approach from typically what the user does. And there are detection tools that have that intelligence now that can recognize a different set of actions that have been undertaken on a device and take immediate remediation steps. Some of these remediation steps could even be automated, so don't require a person to investigate first. So you can automate certain type of actions to be blocked and individual files that look malicious to be quarantined and so on. Complemented with a managed security provision, you can look at further remediation steps and any potential gaps in security that needs to be addressed. But definitely endpoint security and detection is a must-have in terms of starting from that edge, the end user device, and access from that device.
So there's a lot of clever stuff in terms of some of the new technology, isn't there, Mo? Where effectively patterns, you know, if a pattern is broken in terms of access from a location or what they're trying to log into, or the timing is odd, you can design into the solution some real cleverness in terms of highlighting or providing additional challenges or restricting access. All the capability is there now from a technology point of view, isn't it?
Correct, Nick. And just goes back to my point earlier around having that dialogue with barristers to emphasize the benefits that will be gained by having that rationalization of devices, ensuring these devices in a good supported state, and having the security controls in place to provide that protection and detection, starting at that edge at the end point.
Just a question around the network side of things as well, Mo, because you know, we all travel around quite a bit, even in this new world, but working from different locations, the term untrusted network is an interesting one. How you protect yourself in situations where you might be in another party's location using guest Wi-Fi, or on a train, or anywhere else where the Wi-Fi is not within the control of your IT administrator or your managed service provider. What approach should be taken then?
Yeah, so a couple of things that we've already mentioned that could help with that scenario, Nick. Having the multi-factor authentication in place to protect access to applications and data of the chambers, that's definitely one mechanism that would help in that scenario, to add that additional layer of security. So if for whatever reason there is an issue on that wireless network or an attempt to compromise, that additional layer of requirement around multi-factor provides that security protection, and not just relying on a password. That's certainly one aspect. Again, from a web security perspective, having web filtering in place ensures that if there are any potential compromise on that user device, or a malicious network, that the guest Wi-Fi or public Wi-Fi, that somebody might try to attempt to compromise individuals that join to that Wi-Fi, having that web security in place. But the third aspect is detection. Having that detection tooling in place, if there are any attempts or malicious activities or security issues, having that detection capability delivers significant amount of insight, and, as I said, ability to remediate and automate some certain immediate actions to stop any malicious attempt from taking place. So having these provisions in place, and ultimately having that cyber awareness for users, being able to be alert and familiar with some attempts, common attempts of compromise that attackers use. So having that ongoing security awareness would help with that as well. There are additional technologies that are available in terms of network. So what's known as zero trust network access, which the idea that you have a secure connection between your endpoint device and your corporate data and applications from anywhere, and the fact that it's only allowing access by exception. So it blocks everything by default and only allows or enables access by exception. So there's certainly advanced security mechanisms that you can apply to network and remote connectivity that helps with that security piece. So here we kind of conclude with some of the steps that we see as beneficials for chambers to take towards securing your IT environment, your devices, your network provisions. And that's to conduct a security assessment to start with. So that's engaging with a specialist to understand your risk profile, your current security posture, i.e. your provision from a security perspective, identify gaps that you currently have that needs to be addressed, and factors that you need to put in place or consider to mitigate against threats that are targeted for chambers at the moment. That's one action. We certainly could help with that. The second one is around engaging your key stakeholders. So that's going back to what we're talking about, the dialogue internally around security, the importance of security maturity, the importance of cyber resilience. So sharing knowledge to gain understanding and buy-in from the stakeholders around the necessity important of security at the moment, the current challenges, the cyber threats that are facing law firms and barristers chambers, and ensuring the users have the understanding of that in order to aid for their adoption of these security toolings and that and training to enhance their awareness of cybersecurity. And the third element is around planning your roadmap. So depending where you are at from a security provision, there might be 1, 2, or 10 different areas that you need to consider and address some of the gaps that you might have. So having that roadmap that includes immediate actions that could be taken quickly and rapidly to improve your security posture, medium-term and long-term actions to enhance your IT provision, adds that resiliency from a security perspective, from a data protection, backup, disaster recovery, and certainly transitioning into Microsoft 365 and a cloud provision away from a traditional on-premise IT provision.
Thank you, Mo.
No problem, thanks, Nick.
So, final slide, please. So thank you all for listening. Very happy to take questions in terms of thoughts or observations from the audience. You know, there's clearly a lot to be able to cover in this particular area. I mean, one question that I have, just to get the ball rolling, it's interesting seeing the stance of the insurance companies dealing with cyber risk. Increasingly, they are now looking for fairly detailed audits as part of taking on the policy, but also the one which intrigues me is they're now looking for multiple copies of data being held in different locations, you know, actually pushing firms and chambers more in terms of how they do that. What would you comment on that, Mo?
Yeah, so the cyber security insurance is definitely a big area to consider, and the level of IT provision from a security perspective that chambers and law firms, as an example, need to have now in order for that valid cyber security insurance is becoming more and more demanding. So we have seen and experienced some of the requirements around the level of security provision that is on end user devices that are on servers, and the validity of a backup and DR provision that is in place, and that to be fit for purpose. Having that protection and detection tooling as well comes into that. And certainly from some of the engagements that we had with cyber insurance companies, and when they appoint a cyber security forensics company to investigate a security incident, one of the tools that they have to deploy anyway is around detection. So understanding the level of compromise, how badly a network has been compromised, and what data potentially has been exfiltrated or compromised, that requires additional tooling. And there's more and more emphasis on having that additional detection and protection capabilities in place from a cyber insurance perspective, in addition to things like SIEM, security information and event management systems, to keep security logs and audit logs of activities across the network, on servers, access to servers, domain credentials, and so on. Having a log of that is becoming also a requirement more and more often we see.
One of the other interesting questions raised is around protection of passwords. Now, clearly, you can have relatively simple passwords that you change on a regular basis, or you can have highly complex passwords that you don't change on a regular basis. You know, we have so many different passwords now with access to all sorts of different information sources. What's our policy and recommendation around you know, maintaining a vault, if you like, of those passwords, and how regularly should we be reviewing them?
Yes, so a couple of points on that. One is not just rely on a password to gain access. So again, emphasized on the use of multi-factor authentication. That adds that additional layer of security in the event that your password has been compromised, that there's still another element of authentication that is required. So having an MFA is a must-have for barristers chambers if they don't have that provision already in place. In addition to that, from a password management perspective, there are several password management tools that could be used to securely store user passwords in an encrypted vault. They would require a master password that needs to be complex, so that one can't be simple. But yeah, there are definitely tools in place available, that could aid with that. But the first step, and I think that would make sense, is to deploy a multi-factor authentication mechanism across all data and applications that users have access to on or public or over the internet, potentially as an immediate step, because that significantly helps with that potential compromise of credentials and what would happen next. So that's an immediate, relatively straightforward step to take.
One of the questions raised, Mo, is around costs, and some of these solutions can, at the first sight, sound somewhat expensive. But I think there's an interesting debate here, and that is you're either secure or very at risk. But hidden behind that, the fact that a lot of these solutions, they don't have to be CapEx, they can be operating expenditure. And so you can gradually build these costs into your monthly operating environment, operating costs. So that's a bit more straightforward. But I actually think as well, the bit we talked about before, such as cyber insurance, those costs are only going to increase. But the other factor which is interesting is really reputational and keeping secure and keeping your business intact, which is really important.
So all the recommendations that were provided in the previous slides around enhancing the security posture, they're all on a typically monthly type of OPEX model basis. So there's no CapEx investment or one bulky large one-off investment in there. So if the chambers think about it commercially, it's an add-on on a per user per month type model that helps both in enhancing security at the back end, but also at the end user side and the end user devices as well.
Okay. Got another question on here, Mo, which I'll read out for you. Would the webmail application that members use to access their email accounts potentially be insecure, as it can be accessed from the internet anywhere? What's the policy and approach to that? I guess part of that is MFA related, but
yeah. So this is a typical case of adopting Microsoft 365. And it gives us that additional layer of security around access to email. For example, in this instance, the question is webmail, so additional security controls that we can apply. But the immediate action is having MFA in place. So MFA, multi-factor authentication, is a layer of security that would definitely help with that scenario around securing web email, i.e. not using the full Outlook, using web email, which is available externally, and securing that using MFA.
Thanks, Mo. Are there any other questions from the audience? Any particular questions or even points for further discussion you'd like us to address before closing? Doesn't look like it. I hope we've covered everything you wanted to. If not, please feel free to get back in touch. We have another webinar lined up very early September, which is around the same kind of subject, but really looking at how cybersecurity can sit hand in hand with user experience. But if no other questions, then I will thank you all for your attendance and have a safe day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.